Welcome to part two of the Skeleton Key to Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization. In the last video, we worked through the conceptual map of the book. In this video, we're going to talk about the medieval and Gothic era, ending with the Renaissance experience of the separation of folly with the Ship of Fools and with the Pilgrimage of Fools. And then we're going to talk about the Great Confinement and its relationship to Marx's writings on primitive accumulation. We'll probably get that far, okay? So let's just jump right into the book then. So in the preface, Foucault said he's writing a history of madness, but he also is writing a history of that other form of madness by which men in us act of sovereign reason confine their neighbors and communicate and recognize each other through the merciless language of non-madness. So he really wants to write about this, about how through an act of exclusion, those who are not excluded form an identity, right? Okay, so in many ways this is linked to Durkheim's writings on the sacred and profane, even though as far as I remember he doesn't cite Durkheim, certainly not in any detail. That's always been one of my problems with Foucault, is that he could have really benefited from a more thorough grasp of Durkheim and by hewing more closely to a social realist line. But at any rate, so sacred and profane, society is structured by the distinction between things that are set apart. This is in the lecture series on the elementary forms of religious life. So society sets some things apart as sacred. We don't touch them without going through ritual purifications. So that's the thing set apart, and the rest of the world is profane, which means it's touchable and everyday. So yes, elementary forms of religious life is where that's worked out, and Durkheim there describes a triple structure of life. We have a first life that's, again, this is using sort of Bakhtini's language, but we have a first life that's profane, touchable. It's private. We're engaged in everyday, commonplace, individuated employments, normal activity, dispersed family activity, and so on. And then we have the sacred, which is the second life. And the sacred really divides in two at the end of Durkheim's elementary forms. You have the sacred pure, or the good, the God, the good spirits, and so on. And then you have the sacred impure, the demonic, right? Or the devil, that kind of thing, or demonic forces, impure forces. So, both sacred forms are social, extraordinary. They require collective assembly of the group itself, ritual to very carefully govern conduct. These are intense moments of concentrated social effervescence and energy, right? So the profane, a sacred distinction is crucial. And in Durkheim's writings, you use negative rites to purify and remove the profane to approach the sacred. And then once you're inside of the sacred as a believer, a member of a ritual order or society, you then engage in positive rites that feed and take care of and cleanse the sacred. Okay, so the profane must be negated, ritually canceled, removed, purified, in order for the sacred to be realized, approached, and related to. So society is the complex that results from this phase shifting between the first and the second life. This is what Bakhtin called a dialogic view of the world in his writings about Dostoevsky's Politics and Carnival. So these are two phases of society that don't have a route back and forth between them. So Foucault argues that modern society, capitalist society, if properly theorized, is constituted by a process of separation of the mad, or some category of people that are viewed as contaminating and dangerous, right? That there's a moral panic surrounds some marginalized and excluded group. And we separate those mad from the civilized, from reason, from the Enlightenment, and so on. So that's really what his book is about: madness and civilization, or regions, the mad and in the age of reason. So are these things that are separated out, are they sacred? Are they profane? Are they pure or the impure? I think it's very clear to me. Most of what Foucault writes about here is a process of ritual exclusion, whereby someone gets marked with the sacred impure. They become contaminating, ritually polluting, and must be avoided using negative rights and then taking care of with some positive rights, that kind of thing. But and in many ways, removing those people from society and then managing them is a piacular right in a pious right, a right of purification in Durkheim's terms. Okay, so I think these are sacred impure beings that are being placed inside. So again, he's writing not the history of psychiatric monologue or something like that, but an archaeology of the silence that places people in, the origin of the categories, the symbolic order, the symbolic spaces that develop into madness, and then into other categories as well. All right, so he says the Greeks had hubris and the reason madness nexus that he's writing about, he thinks is original to modern society. Okay, so the language of reason, language of madness, it's that language radically excludes. Yeah, so 1657 is when the Hospital General is created in, I think, in Paris, with the Great Confinement of the Poor. That's going to be a crucial moment. And then 1794 is the great liberation of the inmates, of the chained inmates in one of these houses. So I'm telling myself to read the following. So beneath the reversible meanings of all of this, right, of the poor and the employed, the mad and the reasonable, beneath these reversible meanings, a structure is forming which does not resolve the ambiguity, but rather determines the ambiguity. It is this structure which accounts for the transition from the medieval and humanist experience of madness to our own. Okay, so again, to me, you know, the symbolic coding, mad, reasonable, mad, civilized, right? That's categorical distinction is really important. Poor, employed, right? Bad, law-abiding, and that the entire legal order is in many ways constructed by placing some people in prison, and the entire culture of the Enlightenment is constructed by excluding those who are unreasonable and unenlightened. That's sort of his argument here, okay? And so how is this everyday world out here consistent with the symbolic order created by the exclusion of some so that we can recognize these others as a kind of contaminating, monstrous thing to be excluded, right? The marginalized group to be excluded, so that we can identify each other as members of this society of language and law. Okay. Put another way, in using Durkheim's terminology, then the sacred pure is good, the sacred impure is bad. And all throughout this book, Foucault is going to be talking about paired terms of concepts. The leper versus the healthy and uncontaminated. These become sort of transcendent into the sacred pure. The leper falls into the sacred impure. Life in accordance with values falls into the sacred pure, death into the sacred impure, prudence, sacred pure, madness or folly, sacred impure, reason, sacred pure, unreason, insanity, sacred impure, the self-restrained, sacred pure, the unrestrained, sacred impure, the mentally strong or sane versus the mentally ill, that kind of thing, right? So that's his basic argument, is that these fundamental categories are being created through these terms. Okay, so he opens in with the Lazar house. So somewhere between 1226 and 1600, it's on page 3 to 7, there was this massive construction of Lazar houses, right? There were thousands of them, as he says, created around Europe. 2,000 official Lazar houses, 19 within France, 19,000 total in Europe. There were 43 in Paris alone. Some of the largest ones continue on to this day and were used, at least in the 1960s, as houses of containing the mentally ill. So that the very institutions, the buildings that had contained the leper, were being used in the 1950s to contain mentally ill people, the mad. Okay, so why that containment? Why does it continue? Okay, so we did it last time a little bit that the ship of fools emerges in the Renaissance period. So here's one of the poetic illustrations. This is an etching based upon a Hieronymus Bosch painting of the ship of fools. So this is a fantasy that became widespread, really, that we would cleanse the world of the mad. It used to be, prior to this time, that the mad and madness and folly and foolishness were part of everyday life. So, in the images we looked at last time, that the Bakhtinian world of Carnival, or the kind of, the medieval playful world of festival and feasting and again, Mardi Gras, Carnival, Christmastide, Eastertide, right? These moments of celebration, harvest festivals, days of the dead, and so on. This is about folly, right? And, we had that image there last time as well of just the folly of the medieval world. And that the Renaissance period, again, developed a kind of fantasy and partial steps towards the removal of folly from the world. That we're now enlightened, or we're headed towards being enlightened beings. So whatever we are, we're not foolish, that kind of thing. So the ship of fools then emerges around 1500 during the Renaissance. Is all on page 7 to 13. There's an entire dream fleet of these things created. There's tons of paintings and etchings and woodcuts made about this time. Brandt's Germanic poem is probably the most important one here, but there were a lot of different literary, poetic, and artistic representations of ships of fools. They were lived in the social imaginary, but they weren't really part of the real of creaturely existence. People weren't really being hauled off in any large numbers, okay? So the concept of the fool and folly really becomes sort of, again, part of the literary and theatrical tradition during this time. The Dance of Death, Dance of Fools, yeah, uh, yeah, the grinning maniacal skeleton. Oh yeah, he has this argument that prior to about like 1500, there was that the grimace of the skeleton or the death's head, and then bringing out the dead. The death was in the position of the contrast term. So when I was going through the contrast terms just a minute ago, I had this one here, death. So you had the leper, then you had death. In death, by excluding death, you then had life in a world of values, right? And his argument is that the Renaissance substituted folly or foolishness for death, so that you became prudent or a part of civilized society by keeping on this side of the limit of madness or folly. Whereas in the medieval world, you kept on this side of the limit of life by avoiding death, that kind of thing, right? Okay, so he has a section on that. So the ship of fools then removes madness and the fools from working cities and stuff in town. And like he says, in the end, it really wasn't that this happened so much. Crucial. Yeah. Yeah. So it isn't that it happened in large numbers, it's just that there was an imagination that it happened. So I'm supposed to read page 6. So let's do this really fast. There's some good language in here that'll help us understand. So beginning with leprosy, he says on page 6 where the triple X is that, which I can't find. I'll just read my notes. The idea on page 6 is that the symbolic coding of the leper outlasted the disease. And even the brick and mortar buildings constructed to house the category of the leper outlasted the disease. So the real of leprosy left the world, but this category of the leper continues to this day, or and of contagion and of needing to get someone to purify the moral order. All right? So that's on page 6. Page 7, the concept of the leper then gets transferred to other categories who filled out this symbolic space and even at times the physical space that was formerly occupied by the leper. The criminals, deranged, poor, vagrants, vagabonds, the mad, all of these excluded categories, all right? A moral panic is associated with all of these categories. they're contaminating in some way, and hence a desire to keep them at bay. Again, that idea of a negative right to keep us away from the sacred impure. A rigorous division of social exclusion. This is page 7. Page 9. Um, some places for housing the mad coexisted with these ships. Again, he goes in, he makes a kind of error here where he places some weight upon the reality status of the ships. Most historians that I can find don't verify it, and just instead argue that the concept of the ship of fools, where we're getting rid of the poor, excuse me, getting rid of the fools, the idea of getting rid was widespread, and the imagination that this took place on a ship might have been there. But in truth, there were pilgrimages and shrines that were set up, and the poor were sent away there. So I'm supposed to read page 10 regarding ritual division and exclusions. I'm probably not going to. Yeah. Anyway, I think I'm going to not do as much reading as I had planned here. Yeah, so you purify the emerging post Renaissance world with the ship of fools. That was the idea. So the waning of the Middle Ages and the emergence of the bourgeois order is what launches the ship of fools, he says. So page 15 and 17, prior to the Renaissance, the face of death head. Yeah, I already mentioned this. The grimace, the dance of death, the face of death, the feast of the dead, the day of the dead. All of this is probably more important. So morally sanctioned worthwhile life was limited by death, and in the medieval or Gothic world, so the Gothic focus on death, but that the Renaissance, there was a kind of symbolic or cultural focus on fools and foolishness and travesty and motley and that kind of thing. So the limit of so madness or folly substitutes for death as the limit. So morally sanctioned worthwhile life from the Renaissance forward was framed or limited by unreason, by madness and folly. In the classical age, it's reason and unreason are the categories. Okay. I feel like I'm missing a page here. Probably am. All right. So he goes on about the ship of fools, and yeah, by the time he gets to page 23, he mentions a little bit about witches and witch hunting. That this apocalyptic notion, the decline of enchanted magic garden, modern reason. I'll have to skip that, but he does mention what Federici writes about witch hunting very briefly. So when she says that Foucault excludes it, there is at least a brief mention here. So page 24, folly was one of Middle Ages vices. The Renaissance raised to a prime location. Again, these are loose quotations. The page numbers are right. The quotations are a little loose, but yeah, folly was the ultimate cause of sin. Yeah, page 27 on Brandt's Ship of Fools, all sins. Yeah, so there's like 100 and some passengers on the Ship of Fools, and among them were virtually all of the sins, all of the folly, right? So page 30, fools and madcaps appear in literature and theater as a point of identification. King Lear is probably the main one. I actually reread King Lear this week just to get ready for this sort of foolishly, and the fooling King Lear is always a voice of reason, which is sort of the odd thing, right? The one person who tells the king the truth is the fool, right? So, and then in Shakespeare's King John, the bastard plays that same role, a kind of foolish, a man who's a madcap playing the fool, but nevertheless always speaks truth, quite honestly. All right, there's different kinds of madness. I'm going to leave that out. Yeah. So page 32, he says, look, at some point, the fictional or poetic or imaginary ship of fools gets moored into a space of confinement. So he views basically something like the prison or the hospital general, where poor people were incarcerated and where unemployed people were incarcerated and where fools were incarcerated, as being essentially a moored ship of fools, a madhouse or hospital. So then during the Baroque period, the period after the Renaissance, so madness came onto the surface of life, the flourish, the trompe l'oeil, these flourishes that appeared on buildings and artwork and so on. Um, Forced perspective, that kind of stuff. I'm supposed to read on page 37, the conclusion. Yeah, so this world of the 17th century is strangely hospitable in all senses to madness. Madness is here at the heart of things that have been an ironic sign that misplaces the guidepost between the real and the chimerical, barely retaining the memory of the great tragic threats. A life more disturbed than disturbing, absurd agitation inside the mobility of reason. So it's the end of the Gothic era. And so again, the ship of fools was poetic, not real. These pilgrimages were not long-standing. Foolishness wasn't something that was truly a matter of moral horror yet. But that's what happens during the Great Confinement in Chapter 2. Okay, so the Great Confinement, page 38. So the 17th century Great Confinement, where an undifferentiated, heterogenous set of inmates, the mad along with the poor, the unemployed, prisoners and so on, all wind up in the same spaces, many of which are the old leper colonies, and then other ones are constructed as well, right? These new spaces of confinement. So page 39, famous 19th century psychiatrists like Pinel found madness. When they first discovered madness, they found it in these spaces of confinement. And oddly enough, as he's going to argue, they wind up keeping the mad in these spaces while letting everyone else out. Okay. So 1656, there was a hospital general created in which unclassified inmates were placed. Page 39. So all were now assigned to the poor of Paris of both sexes, of all ages and from all localities, whatever breeding and birth, in whatever state they may be, able-bodied or invalid, sick or convalescent, curable, incurable. These establishments had to accept, lodge, and feed those who presented themselves by royal or judiciary authority. So, there's several places in here. In fact, he keeps doing it, where he'll list the heterogeneity of the inmates. So the mad are getting caught up in a more general confinement, right? The Great Confinement. And it's not a place of healing. It's an adjudicative structure, an administrative structure. It's a prison, essentially. And that those who run that have absolute sovereignty over the inmates. The king doesn't have power over what goes on. The power is total in the hands of the keeper, or the prison guard, and so on. And this, by the way, is something that comes back up again in Discipline and Punish, that these are not just juridical spaces, they're sovereign spaces, where the person who runs the asylum generally has total power over what goes inside, right? They're like spaces carved out of society, literal spaces carved out. Page 42, some of these most important spaces were actually originally Lazar houses, right? So it's there. So they originally housed lepers. All right, we got some of that. Authority to confine and control all the poor of Paris was there. And the numbers get pretty significant. So most major cities in Europe created a general hospital following the Parisian model, mostly done by decree. Page 42, I'll leave that out. We already done that. So in England, private enterprise operated the hospitals instead of the state, and they were more focused upon being attached to or being used as workshops and factories. They really, in England, were focused upon building a working proletariat, a wage labor proletariat. So 1670, workhouses were authorized as standalone entities. In 1697, the first workhouse actually appeared, and under corporate management. And so the poor, the inmates were put to work and made to work. Children, women, adults, didn't matter, right? Okay, adult men. Page 44. So capitalism then as a network of workhouses. England, Holland, Germany all had them. So just at the moment when factories were beginning to appear, when the early manufactories with physical hand labor, so too are these workhouses made to appear. Now this is something that comes up In Bill Staples from University of Kansas. He taught a course on social control that I took many years ago, and actually read Foucault for the first time there. He wrote a book called "Castles of Our Conscience." To quote, it's actually the phrase comes out of Foucault. Madison Civilization, but it's really about the essentially, that these workhouses and poorhouses really were a boot camp for the industrial proletariat, a place of training, torture, and terror to help capitalism ensnare the early working class. So page 46, I'm supposed to look at that. Yeah. Yeah, right there it is at the top. This It organizes in a complex unity of new sensibility to poverty, to the duties of assistant, new forms of reaction to economic problems of unemployment and idleness, a new ethic of work, and the dream of a city where moral obligation was joined to civil law and the authoritarian forms of constraint. So these confinement houses were really viewed, again, you could do whatever you wanted to in an authoritarian structure, but it nevertheless had all of the appearance of a workplace, and he worked in a capitalist workplace, had all of the appearance of a workhouse. Okay, so so repression of disorder and control of populations was the purpose of these workhouses, right? Yeah, they weren't about really healing or moral reform or anything thing like that. Okay. Okay, so that brings us up to this. Let's see if I can find anything else that I wanted to do here. Okay, so so what we've just covered in chapter 1 and 2 then, is this great shift. So his argument is that during the Renaissance, the fantasy was we create a clarified, homogeneous space of reason by excluding the unreasonable, by actually getting them to leave. So we're not confining people, we're essentially putting them on a ship or giving them a pilgrimage and having them go away, right? So that would be the Renaissance way of maintaining the distinction between reason and unreason, between folly and prudence. But the great confinement of capitalism gets a shift. You need those bodies in capitalism. Capitalism needs wage labor. So we don't want to get rid of potential bodies to die into production through pilgrimages and ships of fools. Instead, we want to confine. And so the early modern world, these early modern cities, actually drew people in. So if this is an image of excluding and pushing people out who don't fit the emergent order, the era of the Great Confinement was one like a vacuum. You're drawing people in. So you're drawing people in from the countryside who have been displaced from enclosed farms and agrarian homesteads, finding their way to cities, and they're being sucked in and drawn into the city. So really, I think that's the image I want you to have here, is that this is like a giant vacuum, that's what the workhorse of that space of confinement is. And as the masses are coming off of the farms and the peasant villages and finding their way into these cities, and there are spaces of employment, some of which are attractive, most of which aren't. Working conditions are incredibly harsh. Living conditions are utterly miserable. Read Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England, and it's horrific. Many passages in Marx depict the horror of this as well. And so you used to have a farmhouse out in the country and have your own land and so on, and now here you are. And so this is a giant vacuum. And if you wind up inside that vacuum, your entire family is essentially forced into labor without pay in one of these workhouses, separated out, punished. It's an undifferentiated space with all manner of inmates. So your young daughters are working next to incarcerated, badness, right? Criminals, as well as poor people, drunkards, people with mental illness, right, are all going to be in there together. and you're not going to be in a position to protect anyone or help anyone, right? It's a very demoralizing space. So there it is, the giant sucking sound of the Great Confinement. And so people are being drawn into the city, and then they're going to hold on and fight to hold on to even the worst working conditions and wage labor jobs and lousy tenements, because the conditions inside the workhouse are so poor, right? So again, and then once you're inside, you're terrorized, tortured, put to work, exploited, and if not by the staff, by the other inmates, right? And so you're going to do anything you can to not go in there. So it's terror, torture of the working class. So it's the way that the positions and the jobs wind up being filled in the emergent industrial order. So you go from a world of exclusion in the Renaissance into a world of utter inclusion. So there you go. That's what the Great Confinement is. All right. Okay. So here we are. All right. So I made the claim in the last lecture that this is directly linked to Marx's Primitive Accumulation. Foucault makes the same claim. So let's make a brief detour into this. You know, if Foucault is good at choosing good illustrative materials, so is Marx. I grabbed a clean copy of Marx, Capital, Volume 1. This is Part 8, the section on so-called primitive accumulation. So primitive accumulation occurs when, or so-called primitive accumulation occurs when, you know, if I do this in a lot of detail in the Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch lecture series, where I walk through a lot of detail about the enclosure movement and the process of primitive accumulation in England. But what happens is you get an alteration in law and custom and power, whereby the English landlords cease to be aristocratic men of honor and instead become rural real estate capitalists. And what they do is they enclose the common fields and common land that had been used by peasants to sustain their life, to reproduce themselves, and then they get and that is enough generally to force them off the land and into wage labor somewhere else. So the purpose of doing it, as Marx says, is to basically triple. I think that's actually in I've got it here. Carl Polanyi's Great Transformation makes the claim that the value of the land that had been cleared of peasants and enclosed was triple the value of land where the peasants lived. Why? Because after the peasants were driven off the land was turned into what was called sheep walks, places where really sheep grazed for the wool trade. And then, as Marx says later, it wasn't just sheep, it was deer. That there was a time and places, especially in Scotland, where you could make more money getting rid of the peasants, fencing in the land, and letting it go back to native forest to rent it out to rich people as deer hunting land, right? And that you can make more money doing that than allowing your peasants to live there. So the peasants were depopulated. So the peasants lost their living while the deer were flourishing, right? So there's a lot of description of that in Marx's really 4 chapters, beginning with chapter 25 on the secret of so-called primitive accumulation. But I want to point to the exact place. So it's page 882 in the what is this? This is the Penguin Classics Capital, Volume 1. Page 882 is where he directly addresses the Great Confinement. And so it's the spirit, and he's linking it, interestingly enough, to the spirit of Protestantism. In the south of England, certain landed proprietors and well-to-do farmers, this is Marx now, put their heads together and propounded 10 questions as to the right interpretation of the Elizabethan Poor Law. Question 9, they proposed that we shall erect a prison in the parish. So we're not going to give money to the poor anymore. We're not going to just distribute alms to church. Instead, we're going to erect a prison in the parish and then give notice to the neighborhood that if any persons are disposed to farm the poor of this parish, take them and use them, farm them, they do give in sealed proposals on a certain day the lowest price at which they will take them off of our hands, and that they will be authorized to refuse to anyone unless you shut up. Okay, so they're going to basically sell the poor to the highest bidder. If you're unwilling to labor, to go with the highest bidder, right? And not possessing substance or credit to take a farm or a ship to get out of there, to follow a ship of poor people, not fools, right? So as to live without labor, may be induced to make a very advantageous offer to the parish. If any of the poor, okay, I'm sorry, I have that a little bit wrong there. If any of the poor perish under the contractor's care, the sin will lie at his door, as the parish will have done its duty by them, right? So if they die, it's not our fault, it's the proprietor's fault. So we're going to sell the poor up, create a prison, put them in prison. It's so uncomfortable and so awful in prison. You're tortured and terrorized in there that we're then going to auction you off to the highest bidder and be placed to work. And if you die working for them, they work you to death. It's not on us, right? All right. So this is, it is hoped, and this is it's explicit, right? If you don't agree to be locked up and work, you don't get any relief, right? This, it is hoped, will prevent persons in distress from wanting relief and be the means of keeping down parishes. So the whole purpose of this torture and terror was to keep people from seeking poor relief, right? Make the prison so awful that they're not going to want to go. Okay, so he's very clear about that. All right, now there's more in here than this. I probably won't go into it. But again, more on the prison, page 898. This is this incredible section on bloody legislation against the expropriated. So the peasants that were driven off the land, the agrarian workers, the farmers driven off the rural land to make sheep walks and deer hunting territory, faced really hard laws. And so begging was declared illegal. You know, if you get caught begging, you get publicly whipped, imprisoned for 6 months at the first offense, 2 years for the second. And while in prison, you're to be whipped as much and as often as the justice of the peace. Think of it. And if you get incorrigible and do it a third time, I think you get set to hard labor. If you're caught begging again, executed without mercy, right? And so this goes on in France, and there's galleys, Holland. So here's Marx's, thus were the agricultural folk first forcibly expropriated from the soil, driven from their homes, turned into vagabonds, and then whipped, branded, and tortured by grotesquely terroristic laws into accepting the discipline necessary for the system of wage labor. So this is page 899. 899. Right. So the state becomes a necessary adjunct. It becomes the sort of, again, the kind of the muscle of the mafia, basically, of the industrial bourgeoisie. Page 902, maximum wages were established. You weren't allowed to pay more than a certain amount to any wage labor to keep wages low. So on the one hand, the expropriated farmers were being tortured and terrorized in these spaces, being forced to go back out into wage labor, and then there was a cap set on how much a wage laborer could earn. There was no minimum wage. There was a maximum wage, okay? Oh, and if you violated it, it was a tort for the capitalist and a crime. It was a crime for a worker to take more than the maximum wage, but it was only a tort, a fine for the employer. So that's Marx. Okay, so Foucault says again, like 1 out of 100 Parisians were confined in the 1650s, thereabouts. I made the year wrong. But again, these are places of intentional terrorism, intentional torture to drive workers out into the wage labor pool and to work in even the worst conditions. Okay. So let's see if there's anything else here. So that's the Great Confinement. And again, to me, it really truly is the justification for reading this book. Um, so the classical age is what comes afterwards. It used confinement in an equivocal manner, making it play a double role to reabsorb unemployment or at least eliminate its most visible social effects by hiding the unemployed, and to control costs when they seemed likely to become too high, to act alternately on the manpower market and the cost of production. So the claim is that once these poorhouses and workhouses are functioning in this way, you can use it as a kind of way to regulate the amount of wage labor on the market, and therefore keep wage, always having a kind of surplus supply of wage labor, potential wage labor, kind of in a storage cupboard, right, where they could be used during times of expansion, and then release them to keep wages low at that time. So if they absorbed the unemployed, it was mostly to mask their poverty and to avoid the social and political disadvantages of agitation. But the very moment the unemployed were herded into forced labor shops, unemployment increased in neighboring regions or in similar areas. So at any rate, it's this idea that these spaces are part of this um, forcing people into the wage labor system. Now, the reason this is important is because capitalism is often presented as this really naturalistic space. People go to towns and cities to seek a better life because it's better. But Marx is really clear about this. This wasn't a better life. It was the best, least horrible life, if that's the right way to put it, because the conditions were created so in such a negative way by the bourgeoisie and the state apparatus around them. Okay. So once inside the workhouses, they began to put them to work. He has a description of that about page 57. So labor in the houses of confinement assumed its ethical meaning. It's all this stuff. It's a triumph over sloth, right? The vice of sloth. The idle would be forced to work, endless leisure of a labor without utility or profit, right? Yeah. Between labor and idleness, the classical world ran a line of demarcation that replaced the exclusion of leprosy. The asylum was substituted for the Lazar house in the geography of haunted places in the landscape of the moral universe. So these are places of the doomed and despised, right? Of doomed and despised idleness. In this space, invented by a society which had derived an ethical transcendence from the law of work, that madness would appear and soon expand until it annexed them. So yeah, it's going to be out of these spaces of confinement of the poor and unemployed that the matter thrown, and then eventually by the 18th century, 19th century, the poor and unemployed are going to largely be segregated off, and the matter going to be left behind in classified and homogenous organizations. The 19th century would consent and would even insist that to the mad and to them alone be transferred these lands on which 150 years before men had sought to pen the poor, the vagabond, and the unemployed. So again, page 57 is the skeleton key to the book. This is his argument: is that the Great Confinement put everyone in there as an answer to the problems of early industrialization and the forcing of wage labor upon a former rural agrarian workforce, and then by the 19th century, that those institutions and sort of that technology of control was used on the poor, on the mad and segregated institution. Okay, there's a lot in here that's really good. Let's see. Okay, so again, to me, this is sort of the best parts of the book. All right, what happens after that? So now we're going to have an interregnum here. So he's basically going to stop talking about changes to confinement itself. That confinement from then on is pretty much the same. So he's going to go into chapter 3, 4, and 5, and even 6. And those are all 7, I think even 8. That these are all chapters where the archaeology of confinement doesn't change. But what's changing is the archaeology of madness, of insanity, of lunacy even, and of unreason, of madness, right? Of mental illness. And so, chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, he's really walking from the most distant past, from the bottom of the archaeological dig, and then he's working his way up from there towards the modern world. So, let's do these really fast. So, in chapter 3, he writes about the insane. So, sanity and insanity become the distinction. All kinds of lists here of who gets dumped in together in these general hospitals. You get the debauched, the spendthrift fathers, the prodigal sons, blasphemers, men who seek to undo themselves, kill themselves, libertines, the insane, the demented men, individuals of wandering mind, and persons who have become completely mad. No sign of a differentiation. So all of these people are put together in an unclassified, unpartitioned, confined space, right? Sick, criminal, or insane are all put together. Page 66, insane, alienated, deranged, demented, and extravagant are all thrown together in the same place. Confinement is a place of ritual exclusion. So what you're left behind, so that it's sort of like a pit of vices from the standpoint of the outside. So again, going back to that image that we had earlier, if I can lay my hands upon it, right, is that you're throwing people in here so that we on the outside, we meaning those on the outside, will view themselves as not this. So by the time you're done, you're going to get again that list of sacred pure and sacred impure. By placing inside of these houses of confinement lepers, let's see, the unreasonable, the unemployed, the poor, the mentally ill, the debauched, the drunk, whatever the right words are there, that's not who we are on the outside, right? The criminal, the law-abiding, right? So you're creating a positively valued social order by creating these negative spaces. Okay, yeah. So ritual exclusion. So it's really interesting. I just had recorded earlier lectures on Weber on Hinduism, and about ritual exclusion is the mechanism that used to keep the castes distinct from each other, and it's really, really has long-term debilitating effects on social organization and progressive change. You really can't get workers working together in a progressive way because they are excluding each other for caste purposes. Okay, page 68. So the point is that these groups that are excluded then in an undifferentiated way, again, can't bind with those outside. So, okay, page 68. Exhibiting mad. Oh yeah, there's a little bit about exhibiting madness. Let's forget about that. Yeah, so confinement then, page 70, left the reasonable and unmad outside, right? And then there were all these extremes of confinement. So the animality of insanity was talked about. I probably won't read that. Yeah, I don't know. He's got some great examples. So he's talking about that there's something going on with the animal, the creature, in the real of these folks, and so the ability of the insane to endure like animals. The worst inclement weather was still a medical dogma for Pinel. The constancy and the ease with which certain of the insane of both sexes bear the most rigorous and prolonged cold. Being basically spending time out of doors entirely naked in 18 degrees of weather. And that isn't Celsius, that's Fahrenheit, right? No wool blanket, 16 degrees below freezing. A madman in the hospital could not endure his wool blanket. It was too hot. So in the morning, he woke up, opened his door, ran into his shirt into the inner court, taking ice and snow by the fistful, dumped it down. So this belief that you're hot. So anyway, there's something going on in the real, the bestiality. That's his claim. At least that was the belief here that this is going on. Immorality of the unreasonable. I'm going to kind of leave that out. So by the time you get to it, so there's a lot here about Christianity, and by the Enlightenment, Christianity sought to separate natural, bestial evil and sin from the Christian or the saved, reasonable logos of salvation. They kept the mad in Catholic hospitals as representations of sin, I guess, and of immorality. Can't read that, but I'm going to assume that's what it is. You know, then goes on to chapter 4 on passion and delirium. So this covers the enlightenment link of madness to passion, the incapacity to control or moderate one's passion, amorous urges, and so on. Engage in excesses, not restraining oneself, is seen as a core of this sort of thing. Page 89. Usually when I've got these marks, it's because I like one of his examples. Madness then was not merely one of the possibilities afforded by the union of soul and body, it was just one of the consequences of passion, instituted by the unit against the unity, and once again put it in question. Madness made possible by passion, threatened by a movement proper to itself, what had made passion itself possible. Madness is one of those unities in which laws were compromised, perverted, distorted, thereby manifested. So, all those lines seems useful to think. So that's one. Madness then. Passions intensified to mania. He talks about that in hallucinations. Yeah, should I cover that? I don't know. Some of this stuff is kind of interesting. I have to tell you, as a sociologist, unless you are a sociologist of mental illness or a sociologist of the history of the treatment of deviance or something, these sections are less interesting. I'm much interested in the great transition from pre-modern into modern society, the emergence of capitalism and so on. So the chapters I'm focusing on are more interesting to me. There's only one word to summarize this experience: unreason. Yeah. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to actually stop this here, and then we're going to pick up and do the rest of the book in a separate recording.